Hello, everybody. My name is Yuri, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar. Now, what we're going to learn in this webinar? We're going to learn about Query API. And that's the first subject. And second subject is we're going to simulate timeout and then use Query API to retrieve the transaction. If you remember in our previous webinar, what we did, very simple use case. The use case was, I would like to send you $100 and I'm using my bank. In this case, I cannot use the Visa API and I have to use the push API, or we call it OCT, to push it into your credit card. And we're going to use this transaction and look up using Query API. Before we do it, we need to a little bit modify the code to make sure that everything works accordingly and we have all the parameters we need for Query API. So if you look at it, what I want to do, I want to run the OCT transaction or push transaction, and then what I need to capture a transaction identifier, and I have to use acquiring bin for Query API to be able to retrieve the transaction detailed data. That's the first use case. The second use case, what we're going to do, we're going to forward the slide. Second use case, what we're going to do, we're going to simulate a timeout. Again, we are working with the simulators, so we have to tell somehow the simulator, okay, you have to time out the transaction. The way we do it, we basically pass in a header this parameter, x transaction time milliseconds, and we set it to 1, which means 1 millisecond. And of course, there's no way we can give you the result. So in this case, the transaction is going to timeout. In this case, you will get a result code 202, and you are not going to get back a transaction identifier. So the question is, how can you actually retrieve the transaction data? For this, we have something called retrieval reference number and system trace audit number. We call it STAN and RRN. And these two numbers, you're actually in control. You're actually the one generating the numbers. And these numbers can be then used to retrieve the data. And let's start with live coding. Before we do it, let's go back to Visa Developer Center and let's overview what we did last time with the push transaction to make sure we're on the same page. So let me share my screen. It's coming up. Almost there. So what I did, I basically logging into Visa Developer Center, and you can see my dashboard. So I can pick one of my projects, let's say this one, so Visa Direct project. And here you can see all the, for Visa Direct, all the different APIs what's available. Let's click on API Explorer, and let me send it to a new tab. Excellent. Let me find out what we did last time. So last time we did to push transaction. Again, here we go. You can see push transaction. We call it OCT. Here you can see the header, the URL, the header what we have to submit, and payload. Now, if you remember last time what we did, we removed the transaction identifier. And the reason is because, again, the origination is coming from my bank, so there's no pull transaction from credit card. So in this case, I don't need this number. Let's send the request here, and looks like everything is fine. We've got 200. What is good practice? You should always capture the correlation ID. You should, of course, make sure to check the status. And you should definitely capture the transaction identifier plus the additional data here. The transaction identifier is important because that's what we're going to use with the query API. Now let's take a look a little bit here. What else is here? Here you can see the one system trace audit number, which is required, and it's 6 characters, and then retrieval reference number. This one we call RIN and STEM. And if you look at it, how this one is constructed, you see the format is year, day, hour, and then what we are recommending is use system tracing number as an append. So what this gives you, if you look at it, this number is changing every 1 hour. And in my webinar, what I'll do, I'll basically use a random generator to generate the first number and then add these numbers together. And this will basically give you a good amount of numbers which are unique per hour. Another option would be, instead of random generation, to basically use you can use basically a sequence, which might be even better. And this way you basically get 1 million minus 1 transactions. In case you really experience high volume and you feel that this one is not good approach, what you can do, you can of course change this format and add here minutes, even second, milliseconds, and this way you should be always able to generate a unique number. Unfortunately, in this payload, we actually hard-coded these numbers, so we have to change this and make sure that this is really generated. You can see it here, it's hard-coded. And the second number is system trace audit number. Okay, so let me stop sharing right now this screen, and let's go to my IDE so we can make the changes and continue with the query API. So let me stop sharing and let me share my IDE. It should coming up. A little bit slower. Okay. So this is our code from last time, and you can see these numbers are really hard-coded. Then only what we did, if you remember last time, we had to generate the date as well. So let's run it to make sure I didn't break anything. Excellent, so we got the result. Here we go. And result is 200. And inside here, you can see the transaction identifier. So what we really want, we want to capture this number. And as well, we want to capture the correlation ID. The correlation ID is important in case there's a problem. Let's say do some testing and something isn't right. So you call us Visa and we will ask you about the correlation ID. So let's change this. For this, I prepare a couple functions. It's not very difficult, but just paste and copy the code. Again, no worry, you will get all the code. So you don't have to do anything. All right, so here we go. So what I did, I had to import random, and the first number, the stand number, I'm going to just basically generate it randomly. Again, not the best approach, but for the demo is good enough. Otherwise, I'll probably use a sequence number. Second, what we have to do, if you look at it, we have to generate the other number, and the recommended format is YDDDHH, and then we append the stamp. So if you look at the timestamp, what we have to do, basically, we have to split it by T, and in Python, it is a very simple process, and I can do something called chaining. So I just grab the first element, which would be the 2020 and the date and months. Next, what I'll do, I'll split it by dash. I grab the first element, and what I do, I grab -1 index. Basically, what I'm grabbing the last element, which is 0. That's for the year. Now I have to generate the Julian date. For the Julian date, I have here another function, and here I have to use a little bit trick, because what we have to do, we have to generate digits as a 001 till 366. Well, if you run this function, you will get for January 1st 1. In this case, I have to add a little padding here to make sure I get 001. The same, if I run for January 10th, I have to again add padding, because I'll get 10. And what I need 010, so I add padding here. That's the second number. The third number is what we have to do. We have to grab hour. Well, again, if I split this by T and then grab the, that's basically this element, which is 1, and split it by colon, which will give me 3 different elements, and I grab the first one, which is 10. Excellent. And what I do is put it all together, add all these things as one number. So I think right now it's safe to comment these two, and we can run it. I think I didn't break anything. Excellent. So right now it's working fine. What we have to still do, we have to generate and capture the transaction identifier, and for this, again, it's not a very difficult code. So let's capture the correlation ID and the transaction identifier. If you look at it, what we're getting back is JSON. So what I'll do, I'll basically just grab it, the JSON object, put it in RJSON, and what I have to use, I have to basically grab the transaction identifier, which is here. And correlation ID, if you look at, it's coming in a header. So here we go. So in header, I can use header, and I can use a get method, which will basically retrieve any parameters, in this case, X correlation ID. Let's make sure I didn't break anything. Excellent. So you can see we are successful capturing correlation ID and the transaction identifier. Again, the transaction identifier is important because we will need it for the query API. Perfect. So now we're in a good shape, and we can move forward with the query API. So let's go back to VDP, Visa Developer Portal. Let me stop sharing my ID, and let me share back the Visa Developer Portal. It's coming slowly. almost there. Perfect. So this is where we left off last time. Here you can see a query API. So let's click on it. Excellent. So for us to be able to do a query API, you can see it's a get. It's not post anymore. The headers. And here basically what you will get the response. You cannot run it here, unfortunately, so you can see the structure. You can actually see multiple responses for the query API. Therefore, it's a JSON, but it's in an array. Now let's click here and take a look at the parameters. What's required? So required is definitely the acquiring bin. Then one option is to use stan and the RRN. That's one way to do it. And this method we're going to use for the timeout, because in this case, you're not getting the transaction identifier. The second option is to use a transaction identifier. And this is basically what we're going to do. So I can actually grab this and run it and see what's going to happen. So let me paste and copy it. Perfect. Let me stop sharing and let's go back to my IDE. It's a little bit slower. It's coming up. Perfect. So we have to put some code here. Well, we already know that I have to pass some URL, and the URL, well, I just copy it from the website. So you can see first portion, and then I copy this part for the URL. And then we know it's a request. So get, so I can basically grab this part and modify it. Let's, so it's not post, it's a get. And certificate, definitely I need it. Headers, I don't need it. This part I need, and there's no payload, so I can comment it out. And this should do it. Now remember, I grabbed this from our website, so we'll see what's going to happen. Wow. Well, so we've got error, and the error is very simple. We didn't find the transaction. So that's reasonable. We just grab some transaction from our website, and it's not a real transaction. So what we have to do, we have to supply here the transaction we actually captured, which is transaction identifier. We have to put this number and replace it. Okay, it's not very difficult to do it, but we want to make sure that we have enough time to show you the rest. So only what I did, I'm basically concatenating the values, the acquiring bin, and I could have left the number, but I just use variable, which is defined previously here. And to make sure, we have to convert it to a string and replacing here the transaction identifier, which we're capturing right here. Excellent. So this should do it. So let me run it. And again, you have to make sure you convert it to string, because it's actually, if you look at it here, it's a long, and you cannot just concatenate string with a number. So just cast it, and everything should be fine. Let me run it. Excellent. And what you see, basically, we've got a response here with all the details. Now the question is, when do you really run the query API? Do I have to run it on every transaction? No, of course not. You only run it when you need to, and one of the way would be that you get timeout. When you get a timeout, then of course you don't get the transaction identifier, and only what you have to do, you have to use query API to retrieve the transaction details. That would be one way. Another way is maybe later on you want to look at the transaction details because of perhaps chargebacks, etc. In this case, again, use query API. The answer is you only run it when you need to. You don't have to run it, or you shouldn't run it on every transaction. Perfect. So the first part is working. Let me check my time. Let me stop. One thing what we can do, I'll basically grab this, and we can use this for simulating the timeout. So I just grab this code and move it to next step. And then let me stop sharing. And let's go back to Visa Developer Center. Let me share it. Okay, it's coming up. Excellent. Almost here. So we are still at the query API. And let's figure out what to do if there's an error. So you can see here, we have error codes here. So let's check what we have here. And here you have description of the errors and what to do. So if you get 200, everything is fine, no problem. You don't have to do anything. Transaction completed successfully. 202, that's exactly what we're going to do right now. So you've got timeout. And the question is what you do and how you actually even trigger timeout. It's not here. So let's scroll down. And what you see here, you see the header variable, which is X transaction timeout MS. So this one we have to add to our headers, and this will trigger the timeout. If you see, it's in milliseconds. So essentially what I'll do, I'll put there 1, which means 1 millisecond. And definitely this is going to trigger a timeout. Perfect. So let me grab this. We'll need it. And of course, you can see some additional conditions here and what to do. Remember, you're running in a sandbox against simulator, so you have to simulate certain things. Perfect. So let's go back to query API. So right now we have to use the second method. We still have to supply acquiring bin, and now we have to supply Stan and the RIN number, because again, we don't have the transaction identifier. So let me stop sharing and I'll start sharing again my ID. Okay, it's coming up. Perfect. So what I did, I basically moved the transaction in here, and let's make sure it's actually running before I do anything and break it. So right now it's running, and that's the previous transaction. So I'm capturing the transaction identifier and passing it here. Now what we have to do, trigger timeout. Here are our headers. So we have to add one more parameter, the X transaction timeout 1. Okay. Let's switch it here. You can see, you can very simply add it here. Now it's case insensitive, so even if I change it to lowercase, it really doesn't matter. But I just like to use whatever we used on our website to make sure we're consistent. Now, if I run this, it should basically complain. And the reason why it's going to complain is lots of places. First of all, there's no JSON coming back. There will be no JSON. So this part is going to be obsolete. There's no transaction identifier. This part is obsolete. So we can comment it out, but let's just run it. Definitely, it's not going to be 200. It's going to fail here. And it's going to fail here as well because there's no transaction. So let's run it just for fun to see if I'm right. And you can see it's already complaining. What's happened with JSON? Well, we don't have it. What we're having is this number. This is what's coming back. In the old days, there's a method get, and you can use that method and pass this parameter to retrieve the details transaction. However, that's old method. The preferred method is query API. So let me close this. We're back here. So now we already know this part is no good. Fine, let's see. It should break here as well because we are looking for 200. Of course, we're getting back 202. However, I'm looking for 200, so let's fix it as well. And definitely it's going to fail here as well. Again, we don't have the transaction identifier, but let's run it. Of course, it's complaining. We don't have this value. So what value we have? We have to use stan and the RRN. Let's comment it out. If you remember in the beginning, we actually right now generating these numbers. So I pass it here, and we should, if I'm right, we should be able to run it. Excellent. So as you can see, we got back the response. So that's basically how you simulate the timeout and how you to use the query API to actually recover and retrieve all the transaction details. So I wanted kind of wrap this part up. And let me stop sharing. For this webinar, that's pretty much all what we wanted to show. And the reason why we're using the push transaction or CT and we're using the query API is now we're in a good position to show you encryption. And for the encryption, what we want to show you both post and get. That's basically one of the reasons why we actually running this scenario. And this would be part of the next webinar, how to run encryption. And let me stop sharing my IT. Let's go back to Visa Developer Center. It's coming up. Almost here. So again, we cover query API and we cover the push transaction. And next time, we're going to show you how to do encryption. What you have to do, you have to click here, working with the Visa APIs. And there's a message level encryption. And explanation how to enable it. Of course, you have to generate key again. You have to get certificates, all these things, and you can see it. You have to enable it per API you actually want to encrypt. And on the bottom, you should see little functions. We have it for Java, Node.js, and Python. These are only snippets. So what we will do, we will actually show you the full code, working code for encryption and at the same time for the decryption as well. So no need to panic. We'll have you covered. So that's pretty much what's going to be next webinar. We're going to show you in multiple languages, not just Python. Our idea is to show all the main languages. And let me stop sharing. And with this, I would give it to my colleagues and we can start the questions, answers. And again, if you need to reach us, always you can send email to developer@visa.com. Okay, Gautam, if you have any question.
Yes, thank you, Yuri. Hello, everyone. This is Gautam Khanna from Visa. And we have a first question from Izukhanji. And the question is, I have been trying to launch Visa Direct API in my project, izupay.com, but the support is not there. So we can advise you should send us an email on developer@visa.com by letting us know what is the issue you are facing for launching the Visa Direct API. We shall definitely get back to you and we can help you on that. Thank you. And I have another question from Paul. How does the transaction timeout is handled? The answer is the default transaction timeout by Visa is 30 seconds for fund transfer API transactions. However, if you want to set up your own timeout, so you need to pass X transaction timeout MS in the header values, in the request headers, as Yuri has shown. So Yuri has made a value of 1, right? So that he can deliberately make the transaction timed out. But if you want to make it 10 or 20 as per the requirement of your system, you can always pass those values and you can alter that 30-second by default timeout. And to To handle the timeout, you should use the query API, as Edie has used, to know the processing status of your timeout transaction. And I want to say one of the best practices for the query API, you can use it in multiple cases. Like one of the use case is when the transaction will time out, which we have shown it to you today. Another use case is maybe you want to date back and check what happened to your transaction, which you have passed maybe 1 month back, or maybe like more than that. So you can always use the query API for that purpose. But make sure you are only polling the transactions within last 120 days. That is very important. And at the same time, you need to fetch the transaction only for 7 days. So within last 120 days, at the same time, you can fetch a transaction status for the 7 days of time period. Yes, thank you. I think, Edie, we do not have any other question.
There's one question from Richard.
Yeah.
And he's asking, where's the sample code? So the sample code actually should be already posted on internet, and you should get 2 links. One is the sample code, and second link is for the webinar itself, for the recording. If you don't have it, let me check, and we can always get back to you. But definitely, when you get the recording, you should get 2 links, one for the recording and one for the full sample code. And I think that's so far what we have. And again, for the next webinar, let's do encryption. That's everybody's asking us how to do it. And we're definitely looking forward to help you with the encryption. And again, if you need some language, some exotic language, just send us email, developer@visa.com, so we can help you out. Anything else? I think that's all this. I think that's we have all of it. Gautam. Oh, there's one more, Gautam, from Paul.
Yes. So will it be ISO date timestamp? I am not sure like which ISO date, like which field you're referring to, but yeah, about the date and timestamp in the query API, in the query parameters, you can see we have actually given the date timestamp pattern. You should always use that one to get the successful response of your transaction. So it is transaction start date and transaction end date. These are the 2 main query parameters, and there are formats also given on the Visa developer platform.
Yeah, let me quickly check the format. I believe it's ISO.
And one more thing we want to add here. So query API is not a mandatory API to use for every OCT transaction or every push payment or full payment transaction. We want, or we encourage you to use it whenever it is needed. For example, one of the use cases timeout, or in the backdate you want to know the actual status of your transaction. But it is not mandatory to run after every push payment or after every fund transfer API transaction.
So I will look at the timestamp, and the timestamp start with year, month, and day. I believe that's the format of ISO, as far as I remember. But yeah, we can get back to you on this one. And I think that's all what we have planned for this webinar. So I would like to thank you for your time. and definitely looking forward to see you on our next webinar. Thank you very much, and have a great day or night. It depends on your time zone. Thank you.